Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So in this video, I want to talk about the Vienna game for black. So I'm going to be giving a guide for black on how to play against the Vienna, both the Vienna game and the Vienna Gambit, which has been gaining popularity recently because of YouTubers like Levy Rosman or Gotham Chess. So first off, the Vienna game. So after e4, e5, bishop c4, this is one way to kind of avoid the Petrov defense and also say that I want to possibly enter the Italian game, without allowing the Petrov. So for example, after knight f6, if white plays d3, and let's say black plays the move knight c6, then we can get a very simple transposition into the Italian game without allowing black to play the Petrov. But the problem is that with this move order after knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn, and if d3, then black also has the option of playing c6. And after knight f3, d5, bishop comes back to b3 and bishop d6. Additionally, it's also possible to play this move bishop e4 check, which I quite like, saying that now if you play c3, now you no longer have the access to c3 for your knight, meaning that you cannot put pressure on our center. And so bishop d2 is the most challenging move, but still black should be doing quite fine in such a position. And then moves like a5 apparently according to the database is quite strong. And this position is known to be quite good for black. And so that's one option in the Vienna game. The thing is that some players also choose to move knight c3. Now, if we play the move bishop c5, then after d3, d6, white can already start with knight e4 attacking our bishop and just winning the bishop here. So that's one of the additional ideas of the bishop's opening. And so they're just trying to avoid the typical, like Ruy Lopez, Italian game, maneuvering game, and they just want this kind of simple development scheme. Now the problem is that with this move order with knight c3 and bishop c4, it runs into a very common tactic, knight takes e4. And now the thing is that if you take on e4, then after d5, bishop d3, takes, and after f5, black is already much better here. At least slightly better, if not much better, because of the space advantage and the inability of white to take advantage of this weakened diagonal. So I do like this position for black a lot. Now the things that what has been recommended by a lot of coaches and players is this move queen h5. Now this enters the so-called Frankenstein-Dracula variation, which is possibly the coolest name in all of chess openings. And the thing is that we have to be very careful here because they're attacking e5 and they're attacking f7. And also our knight is hanging here. So we only have one move to try to defend this pawn, which is the move knight d6. And this attacks the bishop. So first off, if white plays queen takes e5, winning back the pawn, then we will simply play queen e7. And this endgame is simply fine for black. Now the point to understand is after bishop e3, black can also play the move knight f5, introducing both c6 d5 into the equation to try to block off this bishop, as well as the move knight d4 to try to win the bishop here. And so I think that once black is able to achieve c6 and d5, they're going to be strategically better actually, because this bishop on b3 is actually shut out. So we can also draw a comparison later to a line in the Ruy Lopez. And here, after the move knight d6, white normally plays bishop b3. And the point is that if you play a move like knight c6 to defend the e5 pawn, then it runs into problems after knight b5. Now, it sacrifices the knight, but we cannot take it because our f7 pawn is hanging. And so we're forced to play g6. Queen comes back to f3, threatening mate. And f5 is basically the only move to try to defend. But white still insists on attacking the f7 square with queen d5. And now we're forced to play the move queen e7. This is by far the best move. But the things that it allows knight takes e7, king d8, knight takes a8, and now b6 to try to trap the knight with bishop b7. And many moves have been tried in this position. I think that taking on b6 too early, it gives black an advantage here. And so what white should do is just they should focus on their development, d3, bishop b7, and then this move h4. And this is the point that they're threatening bishop g5. And so the best move here is f4. But still the complications favor white after queen f3, knight d4, hitting the queen, this looks quite active for black, but then again, they are still down the exchange here. And for example, c3, knight takes b3, ab3 opens up the rook's file, and black doesn't have full compensation here. I think white is much better, but the position is still very messy. So this is the problem behind the move knight c6, and why a lot of players try to enter this position. Now the problem is that it's so easy to neutralize white's initiative here with the move bishop e7, simply preparing castles next. And if white plays the move knight f3, it can lead to interesting plays. So we can play knight c6, and of course knight b5 can just lead to castling, which is no problems, you know, for black. So yeah, here simply after the move knight takes e5, black will play, okay, there's a lot of pressure on f7, so g6. And after knight c6, okay, the knight is hanging, so knight c6, dc6, opening up the bishop. If they play queen f3, then we can just simply castle, and later potentially challenge the bishop with bishop e6, for example, and also knight f5 to d4 is an idea. Castles, knight f5, d3, knight d4, queen f4, we can even play bishop e6, and after bishop e3, bishop takes b3, bishop takes d4, we can lead into these interesting complications. Rook fe1, threatening queen e5 now, but now bishop g5 is nice. So the point is after queen e5, we can play f6, queen e6, rook f7, and the forcing lines after this position, bishop takes d3, queen d3, and c5, just favor black, and black is already much better in this kind of position. So threatening, yeah, with queen f3 isn't exactly great, so queen d1 is the best move, since now the queen is not vulnerable to knight f5 to d4, hitting the bishop and the queen. And so after castles, and a5, typical move to try to expand on the queen side, d3 and bishop f6. I already like this position for black because they have the strong bishop on this diagonal. This bishop is not exactly like putting any significant pressure on this diagonal, and at some moment we can even look to, you know, try to win it with knight f5 to d4. So I do like this position for yeah, for black. So the move knight f3 doesn't give white much, but it leads to an interesting game. Instead, queen takes e5 here. And after this position, we can just castle. And the thing that white is arguing is that this knight on d6 is kind of misplaced, and so black cannot occupy the center with c6 and d5. Now, if black is able to accomplish that, then I think black is already doing very well. And so white should probably play d4 here. And after knight c6, the move queen f4. And so the queen is very active on f4. It prevents any knight f5 jumps, and it defends the d4 pawn. Now, there are a couple of ways to try to play this position. b5 is an interesting way, very thematic, to try to discourage casting long from white and, you know, try to rush the pawns up the board. And after knight f3, an idea is also knight e5 to try to win the bishop here. And yeah, after castles, let's say knight b3, ab3, bishop b7, a thematic idea that white can employ is this move d5. Now, this is the thing about this position. If white is able to play d5 here, then it looks kind of uncomfortable for black because this bishop is shut out, and black is not able to play the move c6 and d5 to occupy the center nicely. But black has enough counterplay in such a position with a5, expanding on the queen side, rook d1, and it's very non-standard play as we see. Bishop f6, bishop e3 just developing, b4, kick the knight away to a4. It's important to defend the b2 pawn, but after rook e8, bishop d4, very interesting idea to trade off the bishops, very good idea. We can even play knight e4 here, and after takes, then we solved one of the problems of our position, which is this bad knight on d6. And c4 was played in the previous game. And this leads to a very interesting battle where black is very active, and this knight is offside. But then again, this bishop on b7 is not exactly great. So it leads to an interesting battle, just with equal chances. But I do like the fact that white's structure is kind of damaged. That's one point. So yeah, another idea is immediately playing knight a5. And if white plays knight f3, just surrendering the bishop here, then we can simply take, go with the same idea of b5, castles, bishop b7, d5 and bishop f6, with similar play to the previous position, you know, rook e8, a5, potentially b4 if possible. And the position, it gets very active for black, even though this bishop on c8 is b7 is currently a problem, and this knight on d6 is a problem, since we'll be able to solve both issues later on. But then again, white is arguing that this d5 pawn is kind of a nuisance. So that's a reasonable take. Another way is actually this move bishop d5. And this was recommended by Cyrus Lakdawala in his 1e4 opening repertoire book, which honestly I'm not a big fan of, specifically because of this recommendation to enter the Frankenstein-Dracula. But it's interesting. Now, okay, it makes sense to try to preserve this bishop. There are two ways to play. Knight e8 is interesting to try to solve the problem of the knight. And let's say bishop f3, since it prepares knight f6, followed by d5 next, bishop f3 is essentially forced. After knight f6, now white plays d5. And so this is the entire idea behind white's play. They're also threatening the move b4 here. To trap the knight. And so b5 here is thematic and prepares the move bishop b7. Now if you take on b5, then after rook b8, black gets a lot of activity here. Okay, I mean, at the very end of the line it becomes equal, but for example, a4, bishop b7, hitting this pawn, knight takes c7, d6, knight b5, and just leads to very mass simplifications, which should be fine for black. You can check the details in the study link below. Another way to play is also this move c6. It's a rare move, but it's also a good move. After bishop f3, this move g5, and we see that we're actually weakening our king side here. But the thing is that white hasn't castled. White is the white queen is actually very vulnerable there, and especially noteworthy is that this knight does not have access to the f3 square to put pressure on opponent g5. And so after a move like queen d2, knight d to c4 hitting the queen d1, and d5, I think that black is already slightly preferred here because of the space advantage, the development advantage, while white has no concrete attack going on. Now the problem is that again this knight on a5 isn't great, so at some point maybe we'll play like knight d6, bring the other knight to c4, and try to maybe rook e8, maybe stick a knight on e4 or like bishop f5, things like that. And you can just play the position based on this fact. But then again, black is kind of weakening their king side, so white can try to take advantage of it with h4, but now we can simply take, and there is still no attack, so we shouldn't be afraid of ghost here. King f1 is the best move, bishop f5, developing actively, bishop e2, and now bishop g6, just covering the king very nicely. So after knight f3, knight d6 bringing the knight back, bishop d3, and now bishop f6. And I already like black's position a lot here because we can bring the a5 knight to c4, bring the rook to e8, and bring the knight to e4, where we're actually currently up a pawn, and white does not seem to have a strong attack going on anytime soon. So this is kind of the an interesting idea in this bishop's opening line. So yeah, more or less chances are equal, but if black knows what they're doing, I think they can get a very comfortable game. Now it's not like, it's not like saying that the Frankenstein-Dracula is a bad opening per se, but if black knows what they're doing, they're gonna have no problems at all, and they can even try to fight for advantage. A tiny advantage, but it's still noteworthy that white has to kind of preserve this bishop if they wanna try to maintain the bishop pair, and any inaccuracy can essentially give black a very easy game. So that's the Vienna game in itself with the Frankenstein-Dracula variation. The next variation we're going to look at is the Vienna Gambit, which occurs after e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, and f4. So in this position, it's important to counterstrike in the center with d5. Now, if we take on f4, then I think this is already a very bad move after e5. Our knight cannot go to g4, cannot go to h5, it can't even go to any of the central squares, so it has to go back to g8. And after knight f3 followed by d4, white is already much better. So yeah, after d5, this challenges the center very quickly. And if they take on d5 here, then after e takes f4, this just transposes basically to the king's gambit, where the Falkbeer counter gambit, I believe. After f4, d5 takes, white can play knight c3 and then knight f6, then it transposes essentially, where this position is known to be very much fine for black. Instead, knight c3, knight f6, f4, after d5 we strike in the center, f takes e5 is the best move to attack this knight, and knight takes e4. Now, if you take on e4, then ideas of, first off, like this pawn being very weak is one thing, and we can just pile up pressure with like knight c6 and even defend the pawn if necessary with bishop f5, while white does not have the luxury of, pushing pawn to d3 and defaulting the bishop out to f4 to defend the pawn. So instead, queen f3 is the best move. And here, traditionally, what has been chosen in the past is knight takes e3. And after both d takes e3 and b takes e3, which leads to different approaches, black can play bishop e6, bishop f4, and then c6, and try to play this position, knight e7, bishop e7, and they can consider casting short or casting long. But what I'd like to recommend is actually this more of a rare move, knight c6, but it's definitely not unknown to Vienna Gambit players. Now, the reason I want to recommend this is because there are a lot of moves that lose here for white at first, so it's a bit, it's a bit trappy. But the point is that d3 here immediately loses to knight d4. Since now the queen is being attacked, c2 is also weak, so after queen d1, simply the queen rushes into h4, giving a decisive check, and g3 is forced, after which knight takes u3 just wins. So instead, if they play knight takes e4, then we have the very nice intermezzo knight d4. Now queen d1 can be simply met with d takes e4, and if you kick the knight back away, then for knight c6, black is simply up a pawn for gonna be up a pawn after the e5 pawn falls. So instead, queen c3 is best, but after d takes e4, we have a nice knight in the center, f3 cannot be occupied by the knight, and so knight e2 is kind of forced, after which we'll simply retreat with knight c6, hitting the e5 pawn, and knight g3 is possible to try to hit this pawn, but now we'll just defend the pawn with queen d5, bishop c4, and now queen takes e5. And if you take, then the bishop is being hit, so we can follow up with f5 next, defending the pawn. Meanwhile, if you castle now, then after f5, still black is doing much better, since, takes will still attack the bishop, and so black is just up a pawn easily. Instead of b3, trying to develop the bishop along the across the long diagonal, best move here, and it's kind of not very intuitive, but is the move bishop g4. Now it looks very natural to play bishop f5, but after bishop b2 and let's say bishop b4, hitting the queen, queen e3, queen e7, trying to win the pawn, white has this move queen f4, attacking the bishop. And if we come with bishop g6 back, white can play a3, kicking some of our pieces back, bishop c5, b4, bishop b6, and with counterplay after c4. So this is kind of what I want to not allow, is this maneuver with queen e3 to f4, hitting the bishop with tempo. And so bishop g4. At some moment, we're going to be ready to take on e2 if it's forced. For example, h3, we can play bishop b4 first with tempo, queen g3, now we can give up the bishop takes e2 and castles, after which black is much better. If you play castles, then queen d4 simply wins the rook. And otherwise, the e5 pawn is weak, more weak than this e4 pawn, because white's diagonals have not been opened yet. For example, if this pawn were on d4, then this bishop's eye would be opened, but it's not the case. So black is much better in this kind of position. Instead, the best move here is bishop e5, hitting the knight here so it doesn't allow knight d4, but now we'll play knight takes e3. And now this changes things a bit. If you play b takes e3, then after queen h4 check, this sequence of queen h4 check followed by queen e4 is very important. Now after g3, queen e4 check, takes. Now we reach an interesting position. If possible, we want to play bishop g7 next, so white doesn't damage the pawn structure. But instead, they have to take on c6 now. And after bc6, knight e2 is very logical, but now we'll play bishop c5. And if white plays d4, hitting our bishop and trying to fix the pawn structure, sure, they fix the pawn structure, but turns out the bishop pair is a much bigger factor here. Bishop e7 is important to maintain control of this diagonal, not allowing bishop e3, castles, bishop e6, and these pawns simply cannot advance. Let's say knight f4, bishop c4, rook d1, and moves like a5. And we're going to be ready to kick the knight away with g5 next, since this is not a stable outpost for the knight. This bishop on c1 is quite bad, and we have also access to the open file. This a2 pawn is also weak, so white cannot play rook b1 easily. So black is doing much better there. So instead of d takes e3, we will still go for the same sequence of queen h4 check, but the difference is now after g3, queen e4, takes, knight e2. Okay, first off, if bishop takes c6, it's kind of unprovoked, that they're giving up the bishop, so we should be quite happy to see this position. Knight e2, bishop c5 again, but the thing is that now white has access to d4, so that's kind of what white is arguing. And here bishop e6 is best. Now if you take on c6, then bishop e7 would gain control over the long diagonal nicely. So a4, a5, bishop f4, and then c5 here, kicking the knight away from its outpost, knight b5, and now the move bishop g4 is quite strong, preventing both long castling, preventing rook d1, and also we also can prepare long castling ourselves. We see that a lot of the light squares are weak in such a position, so black is doing better. So giving out the bishop unprovoked is possible, but it's not really great. Instead, knight e2 is better, and after bishop d7, now you kind of have to give up the bishop because the e5 pawn is falling otherwise. So bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, rook f1, putting pressure on the f file, bishop c5, knight d4, hitting the bishop. So now bishop d7. We don't want to give up the bishop here since it's what we're fighting for to try to maintain an edge. But so instead, white can play rook f4 and actually win the e4 pawn. But we don't care because we'll just castle, bring the rook to rook to e8, and just activate our pieces. At some point, we want to play f6. For example, after bishop f4, f6 already liquidates the position since white is virtually forced to play e6. Give back the pawn, bishop d4. Okay, rook d4, then rook takes e6, king f2, and bishop c6 sacrifices the c7 pawn, but black has tremendous control over the e-file and is already threatening to infiltrate. So white probably has to defend the second rank with rook d2, then king f7, c4, and just like, improving moves like h5, rook f1, rook 6 to e7, and attacking the bishop, so bishop d6, rook e4, hitting the c4 pawn, b3, and moves like h4 here already give black a lot of counterplay. So black is not doing any worse in this position. I think that the 3-on-2 on the king side of the board is actually more important than the 4-on-2 on the queen side. Yeah, so this is gives black just equality. Instead, if they play cd4, then after rook e6, and we trade off the pieces here. So after here, like long castling, so if you take on c7, I believe rook f7, or actually rook c8 here just actually wins the c2 pawn, so that's not very good for white. So instead, long castling is best, but now c6. And this is just a very equal position. So in conclusion, the Vienna Gambit is not a bad opening, but black can equalize if they know what they're doing, and there are some traps that white should avoid in this specific sharp line. So yeah, that basically sums up the Vienna game and Vienna Gambit, how you can play as black to neutralize it, and also some interesting ideas. So we can actually compare the variation with the Frankenstein-Dracula, where we see that after queen h5 and knight d6, we see that the long-term disadvantage of this knight on d6 is that it doesn't allow the d-pawn to move forward to d5 and challenge white's center after white eventually takes on d5 and plays d4. So we can actually compare that to this variation after knight f3, knight c6, and in the Ruy Lopez after the Berlin defense. One of white's options is to play castles, knight e4, and rook e1. And for knight d6, we see the similarity behind the two positions where white can play knight takes e5, bishop e7, bishop f1, takes, castles, and we'll get a very similar position as we see here. Rook e1, okay, let's say there are a couple moves, knight f5 is one of the main moves, and black wants to play d5 next. And I think that black is actually managing a lot of times to get this pawn to d5. Otherwise, if white plays the move d5 themselves, then this bishop's eye gets opened, and black is quite happy with such a transformation. So yeah, if we're able to get d5 in this position, I think that black is doing quite well and shouldn't have any problems structurally. And so even though the computer prefers this position compared to the Frankenstein-Dracula variation, I think that practically it makes more sense to play the Frankenstein-Dracula compared to this position as white, because we saw that oftentimes, the imbalance of black's inability to play pawn to d5 makes it quite challenging to play principal chess and get an equal position. They're gonna have to play very dynamically and know a lot of stuff to actually neutralize the problem of their, the knight on d6 and the inability to play pawn to d5. And so I think that that's honestly a better try than playing this line of the Ruy Lopez. But that's just my opinion. It's, it depends on what you like to play, and that's just like based on my experience on what I found interesting. Yeah, so hopefully you enjoyed that video. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any comments, suggestions, or additions to the lines or insights to this video, then please let me know in the comments down below. Thanks so much for watching. See ya.